This morning, though, tensions are continuing to ramp up between the U.S. and Russia.
Military officials say they're watching the number of Russian troops grow along the Ukrainian border. Despite Russia continuing its military buildup, President Biden says he has no intention of moving U.S. military forces into Ukraine right now. But the president says he would consider imposing sanctions directly on Russian President Vladimir Putin.
There will be enormous consequences if he were to go in and invade, as he could. This would be the largest, if he were to move in with all those forces, would be the largest invasion since World War II. It would change the world.
This morning, more U.S. aid is moving into Ukraine. This video shows members of the Air Force loading defense equipment, including ammunition and weapons, onto a cargo plane at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. All as Russia keeps the world guessing, still denying it will invade Ukraine and holding new military drills yesterday in neighboring Belarus. We have a team covering the growing tensions from Russia to Washington. NBC News reporter Matt Bodner is in Moscow, and NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli has the latest on the Biden administration's response. Matt, let's start with you. Russia's foreign minister finished an address recently to the Russian parliament this morning. A lot of it focused on the ongoing tensions at the Ukraine border and the U.S. involvement in the crisis. What did he say, especially when it comes to negotiations with Western countries?
Thanks, Joe. Well, I know we've all been holding our breath, looking for some sign Russia's prepared to move to a path of de-escalation, but we're just not getting that here in Moscow. Foreign Minister Lavrov actually took a very different tack, insisting that if there is de-escalation, it will be on Russia's terms. They will not allow their security proposals, as they call that list of demands, to be ignored. They will not wait forever for them to be addressed, and they're promising some kind of response. They are, of course, being very vague on what that response could possibly be, but there's 100,000 Russian troops on Ukraine's borders, so it doesn't take too much imagination, I think. This is all coupled with additional rhetoric from Lavrov today saying that the United States and NATO are inflaming the tensions. They're putting responsibility squarely in the West's corner, and they're also warning that the West is encouraging Kiev to make an assault on eastern Ukraine on Russia. So it doesn't exactly look encouraging from over here right now.
Let's talk about the American response, Mike. President Biden is considering economic consequences for Russia if it sets foot in Ukraine. He says, at least so far, he has no intention of moving U.S. forces into Ukraine. But what is the president saying about possible troop deployments to the region?
Well, Joe, since the earliest days of this standoff over Ukraine, you've heard U.S. officials talking about two different paths here, one of diplomacy and one of deterrence. Well, as Matt was just laying out, those diplomatic efforts appear stalled at this point. And increasingly, you're hearing U.S. officials talk about not just economic sanctions, but those potential deployments of U.S. forces. 2 days ago, you had the Pentagon talking about calling up more than 8,000 U.S. forces, putting them on alert. And yesterday, the president talked about a timeline for potentially deploying them. Listen to what he told reporters.
What would lead to that is what's going to happen, what Putin does or doesn't do. And I may be moving some of those troops in the nearer term just because it takes time. We have no intention of putting American forces or NATO forces in Ukraine. But as I said, there are going to be serious economic consequences if he moves.
When the president talks about not putting troops into Ukraine, it's important to make a distinction here that when the president is talking about those deployments, he's really responding not just to the concerns of Ukraine, but of our NATO allies who are neighbors of Ukraine. When Russia moved and put some military exercises underway into neighboring Belarus, that really raised the alarm bells of our allies. But as President Biden put it yesterday, he thinks really only Putin knows what he's really going to do, and that's really what's going to determine the next U.S. move here.
So, Matt, as Mike mentioned, the U.S. has more than 8,000 troops on high alert. Other NATO allies are also putting together a line of defense across Eastern Europe. What kind of help is coming in from other countries?
What's actually really interesting, we're seeing some pretty significant NATO movements, not, of course, at the scale Russia is deploying, but we're seeing Western European members send things like airplanes, ships. There's been talk of troops. We're also seeing weapons deliveries, just moving equipment into Eastern Europe. And it kind of paints this picture of, let's assume that Russia's only goal here was to try to bluff its way into breaking NATO or pushing NATO out of Eastern Europe. We're seeing the exact opposite happening.
And Mike, Russia is a major oil and fuel source globally. There are concerns Russia could cut off fuel shipments. So what's the White House doing to try and avoid a disruption in the world's fuel supply?
It's interesting, Joe. Yesterday, we saw the White House discussing two potential avenues to deal with areas, one where Russia has significant leverage and one where the U.S. does. And you mentioned the first one. Russia has significant leverage in terms of its energy supplies. Western Europe really dependent on Russian sources of natural gas in particular. So U.S. officials say they're working to try to find supplies of non-Russian natural gas that they could position into Europe to make them available to some of our allies should Russia decide to cut them off. In response, though, the U.S. is also talking about what they're calling novel export sanctions on Russia, which would potentially mean cutting off supplies of advanced technology like microchips, which are necessary for Russia as they try to diversify their economy beyond energy supplies.
Matt and Mike, a lot to cover this morning. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Now to the latest on the pandemic and the surge in Omicron cases. While hospitalizations are still up across the country, some states are seeing a decline. One state that's past that peak is Rhode Island. Right now, 460 people are in the hospital with COVID in the state. And while that number is still high, it's definitely better than the 592 hospitalizations the state saw less than 10 days ago. NBC anchor Yasmin Vasugian joins us now from outside Rhode Island Hospital in Providence, which was pushed to that breaking point just earlier this month. Hi, Yasmin. Good morning.
Good morning, Savannah. It was pushed to the breaking point. It seems as if this hospital in Rhode Island, which I've been reporting from for the last couple of years throughout this pandemic, was really hitting its peak about 10 days or so ago. They were pushed to the brink, as you mentioned, totaling cases over 500, now below that 500 number, but still this hospital very much pushed to the brink, the ICU, the emergency department as well. But we remember from the president's announcement just about 2 weeks or so ago that they were going to send military personnel to various hospitals throughout the country. This is one of the hospitals in which those military personnel have now showed up just a few days ago. 20 doctors and nurses here helping out with the effort to fight the Omicron variant and the COVID surge here in Rhode Island. Want to bring in the president of the hospital, Dr. Weingart, who has been experiencing kind of the surge throughout the last year in which you've been on the job now. And of course, now with the military personnel in place to help with the hospital surge. Talk to me about how that's been for you.
It's been incredibly helpful for us. Emotionally, morally, it's been a real lift to have additional skilled staff with us. What we've been able to do practically is assign the staff from the military to a variety of different units, largely to our COVID intensive care units, but we've been able to assign staff to the emergency department and also to our med surgical area. It's been very, very helpful.
Do you feel like you're past your surge now of this Omicron variant?
So we were at a peak census of COVID patients of about 170 patients in our hospital, which was about 1 in 5 patients on the adult side.
Wow.
We were there for about a week. Over the last 4 or 5 days, we've begun to see the numbers come down. So we're certainly on the downtrend, but we still have a full hospital with lots of COVID patients and pushed to capacity.
How long are you expecting the military personnel to stay in place?
All right, so they began last Saturday, and they have a 30-day assignment with the possibility of renewal. So we'll see how that goes, depending on our volume.
And what do you expect? Expect with them to stay?
We expect they'll stay 30 days, and we're hopeful that they may be able to stay longer, and that period will be incredibly helpful. It took about 6 weeks to get into trouble, and it'll take probably a similar amount to come down. So the fact that they're here at the time when we're just cresting has been perfect.
How worried are you about the next variant, the next surge?
You know, we're always worried the fact that we've had so many variants. We're expecting there'll be another at some point. We hope it won't be as catastrophic as Omicron, but at this point, we don't see any signals around the globe that there's something that's brewing that's going to be as problematic.
Last question to you. A number that I found interesting was that folks that were coming to the emergency department here and not being seen during the surge, right? And now that number being reduced with the military personnel because of the fact that you have more hands, more people. And you talk also about the psychological implications of having these folks here. Can you expand a little bit on that?
So there was a period about 2 weeks ago where we had very high numbers of patients leaving the emergency room without being seen. I think that's what you're referring to. Yeah, so those numbers have come down, and it varies day to day and hour to hour. But we've seen those numbers come down from the double digits to the single digits. I think it's partly because people are now perhaps avoiding emergency rooms because they know about the wait, but also because our throughput has improved and our capacity has grown.
Got it. And then, of course, the psychological implications just for your staff, for the doctors and nurses that have been overrun for the last couple of years of this variant and COVID in general. Dr. Weingart, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
The one doctor I haven't met at this hospital as I've been covering this pandemic here. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So, Savannah, as I mentioned, right, they hit their peak here, and obviously Dr. Weingart hoping that the peak is now past and they're on the downturn of this Omicron variant. But nonetheless, the surge of this military personnel, the 20 or so doctors and nurses here, very much helping out with the efforts to fight COVID here at Rhode Island Hospital. Yeah, and the doctor with a little bit of hope there that we're not seeing any sort of signs of trouble brewing somewhere across the globe. That's great to hear. Fingers crossed. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Yasmin, and please thank the doctor for his time on our behalf as well.
Now let's bring in our own doctor, Dr. Bob Lahita. He's a professor at the Hackensack Meridian Medical School, director of autoimmune and rheumatic diseases at St. Joseph Health, and the author of the new book, Immunity Strong. Dr. Bob, always good to have you with us. So a new study found a blood test could someday help determine who's at risk for developing long COVID. Why is this so important, and could it help people experiencing long COVID now?
Well, Joe, this is of major importance. All of us have wondered why you develop long haul syndrome. Roughly half the patients that get COVID, and this study was before the vaccine, so we were dealing with the Delta variant. It seems that certain antibodies in the blood are not there when they're needed in certain people. And asthma and old age, and if you have a lot of allergies, your propensity for developing long haul syndrome is higher than anyone else. So that's the study, and it's out there now and very interesting.
Doctor, I want to ask you about something that sounds troubling. We did just hear from this other doctor in Rhode Island that it seems like things don't seem to be bad on the horizon, but scientists are keeping their eye at least on what's basically a relative of the Omicron variant. It's being called the stealth version of Omicron. That's because it's harder to detect. What do we know about this, and should we be worried about this stealth variant? Is this some new thing that could cause an issue like Omicron did?
Yeah, well, Savannah, it doesn't have its own Greek name yet, but it is a first cousin of the Omicron variant. And it looks like the Delta variant, the one that was very, very serious and caused a lot of deaths early on. It's more common in Europe, this BA2, as we call it. BA2 is 45% prevalent in a country like Denmark and other parts of Europe. So it has 20 more mutations in the spike protein. And as you know, the spike protein is what determines the infectivity and how severe the disease is going to be when you get it. So it is a concerning variant, but it is not a true mutation variant like, say, the Delta and the Alpha and the Mu and the Lambda. So it's still Omicron. It's a first cousin of the Omicron.
Before we let you go, Dr. Bob, we do have a viewer question for you. It's from a parent who is hesitant to get their 7-year-old vaccinated. It says, what is the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine if I only allow my child, a 7-year-old, to have one dose? Your thoughts?
Well, the clinical research has indicated that your child should get vaccinated, number one, and should have 2 doses like adults. But the microgram quantity of the virus antigen is about 1/3 in the child. So it's not severe, and we know that that can produce a robust immune response very quickly in a child that's, say, 12 years of age.
All right, Dr. Bob Lahita, as always, thank you so much. And if you have a question for one of our doctors, you can let us know. They're ready to answer your questions. Email us at morningnewsnow@nbcuni.com with your questions, and you can let us know if you prefer to stay anonymous.
Now, as Omicron spreads, many EMS services are dealing with the crisis of staff shortages. It's something that's crippling emergency response crews across the country, forcing ambulances to stay at hospitals for hours waiting to drop off patients. NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff rode along with EMTs in Sacramento to see what they're experiencing firsthand.
In California's capital, the first responders citizens turn to for help are now saying they need it too.
We're with Sacramento Metro Fire, and we're on our way to a call for a 34-year-old that's supposedly coughing up blood. Once these EMTs get there, they're able to treat this patient, and there's no guarantee that patient's going to be able to get into the hospital.
We pulled up to find a patient having a medical episode that wasn't life-threatening. Captain Parker Wilburn is with Sacramento Metro Fire.
What would seem to be an emergency for them is obviously not an emergency to us. Essentially, all we're going to be doing is giving him a ride to the hospital.
And you think he's going to get in right away when he shows up?
Absolutely not.
No?
No, this ambulance will then be out of service for at least 1 hour. We're getting called out because people can't, they're unable to sleep. At 2 in the morning, I can't sleep. I want to go to the emergency room, and we try and educate in those moments. But sometimes we get repeat offenders where they call us multiple times, sometimes in one day.
Hospital delays aren't new, but the Omicron wave, crippling staff shortages, and an extremely high volume of non-emergency 911 calls has made it worse. Wilburn says in the county, ambulance turnaround times that should be 15 minutes averaged over an hour last month.
They're sitting inside the hallway of the hospital. We call it wall time because they're sitting on the wall waiting for a bed.
Soon, another call comes through.
We've got a rollover vehicle accident.
We head out to meet a team from another station.
And this is horrific. She doesn't look like she has life-threatening injuries. Is there any guarantee she's going to be seen right away if she goes to the hospital?
There's no guarantee she's going to be seen right away.
How much of it is COVID?
COVID's brought a light to an issue that was already here.
At minimum, there is a 10% gap in the number of providers, clinicians needed to staff ambulances and to do EMS work.
It's not even 10 o'clock in the morning yet. So it's
9:29.
9:29, and we'll have 3 ambulances stacked up. Before noon, we'll probably have 5 or 6.
This is every day?
And this is every day. So last week we had 18 ambulances that were stuck at a hospital in the Sacramento area.
They're constantly asking us, can you clear the hospital? How much time? What's your ETA? And we really don't know. I write to dispatch a lot. No bed, no ETA.
For EMTs, stress exacerbated by a pandemic may now outlive it.
How much longer can you all keep going like this?
I'm really unsure. People are overworked. We're working as much as we can. I don't know how much longer we can do it.
Under pressure and unsure when relief will come.
Tough to see all that. Our thanks to Jacob Soboroff for that report.
A House committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack is moving forward with more depositions. That includes a meeting with Alex Jones, the controversial radio host and conspiracy theorist. Jones says the remote interview happened on Monday. During his radio show, he told his listeners that he exercised his Fifth Amendment rights almost 100 times during the deposition. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale joins us now. Ali, good morning. So walk us through what happened in this deposition. Do we know why Jones pled the Fifth so many times?
Well, Joe, you plead the Fifth when you don't want to incriminate yourself. It's something that we've heard from other Trump allies, a strategy that they've said that they're going to employ once they're in the room with the January 6th committee. Jones yesterday on his radio show saying that he invoked that privilege almost 100 times. He says, though, that it wasn't because he did anything wrong. Instead, he says that it's because he didn't want his words to be twisted by the committee. Nevertheless, the committee says that they haven't necessarily learned anything new from him. But I think what's so striking here is that Jones said on his radio show they already had all of the texts and communications that he had sent from that day. They knew who he was talking to and what conversations he was having. That's why we've seen it so important, the committee going after the documents and the information that's tangible and physical, as well as the information that they can get from physically sitting down and talking with these witnesses.
So, Ali, we know the House committee subpoenaed Jones back in November. You just said the committee says they really didn't learn much from him. But remind us, why did they want to speak with Jones in the first place?
In a letter that they sent to him when they first asked for him to come cooperate, they said that they had information that showed that he may have funded or helped to plan the rally on the ellipse on January 6th, and that he was supposed to lead people to the Capitol. In the days before January 6th, even on his radio show, he said that the 6th was going to be wild. So the committee, of course, wanting to speak to Jones to that end. But here's what Congressman Jamie Raskin said about what they heard from Jones.
That Mr. Jones and all of the defendants and all of the witnesses are forgetting is that the Fifth Amendment is meant to be used selectively if you think that you might be incriminating yourself by answering a question. It's not a magic wand that you wave over the whole proceeding and you don't have to answer anything.
And Joe, it's important. Raskin in that same interview said he wasn't physically in the room for the Jones deposition. He didn't think that they learned anything new, but he was still going to have those conversations. But he brings up a really important point here about the non-magic wand use of pleading the fifth. He goes on in that interview to talk about something called use immunity, effectively that this committee could say, okay, you can talk about the things that would otherwise incriminate you. We are making the agreement that we will not go after you or prosecute on those things. There is a wrinkle here, though, because the committee's work is separate in some ways from what the Department of Justice is doing. And so there are questions in the legal community about whether or not the sixth committee granting that use immunity also translates to what the Department of Justice could do with the information the January 6th committee gets from some of these witnesses. So that takes us down the legal rabbit hole just a little bit, but it's one of the things that's percolating in the background here as more of these Trump witnesses say, I pled the fifth in these closed-door meetings.
Okay, and Allie, I quickly want to ask you about another headline from the Hill. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she's going to run for re-election in 2022, but didn't specify whether she'll want to remain the Democratic leader in the House. What can you tell us?
Yeah, ending speculation on one front, but keeping speculation on the other. On the front that she's ending speculation, there had been conversations about whether or not she was going to leave Congress after this term. Clearly, she says she's running for re-election once again, but there is still the open question of whether or not she would try to run for Speaker again should Democrats manage to retain their control of the House. We know that according to our Meet the Press midterm meter and other metrics that we track typically in these midterm years, it doesn't look great for Democrats. We're seeing lots of retirements as well as lots of tough swing districts. At the same time, though, Speaker Pelosi saying that she's going to at least run for re-election, and we'll deal with the Speaker bid later.
All right, Allie Vitale, lots to cover this morning. Thanks so much. And let's get a check on your morning news now weather.
Which means it's time for Bill Cairns to join us, and I think you might have a lot to tell us about.
Yeah, a lot of snow, a lot of cold, and then a lot of snow coming. All right, so yesterday, the snowiest spot in the whole country was in Colorado and right along the Colorado-Kansas border. It was a narrow band of very heavy snow. But at one point, Interstate 70 was closed yesterday, and one location in Kansas picked up 27 inches of snow. Now, this is Broomfield, Colorado. This wasn't as bad as around 4 to 5 inches. Denver itself got 4 to 5 inches. But right along that Kansas-Colorado border, I mean, it was like a snowstorm like they've never seen before. The all-time snow record in Kansas is 30 inches. And they saw 27 inches yesterday. Pretty wild stuff. So now let's get to the freeze, because a lot of us are feeling it this morning. Coast to coast, north to south, everyone except really southern Georgia, Florida, and South Texas. 226 million of us have a temperature 32 degrees or colder. But when you factor in the winds, it's still pretty brutal and dangerous. Minnesota, Iowa, it'll improve today as the winds come down. Temperatures will moderate a little bit. But this morning, it's still really cold and dangerous. Negative 31 right now in Minneapolis. Green Bay feels like negative 29. So it's hard to complain everywhere else when you see numbers like that. But it will warm up eventually, but the cold will stay with us, and especially cold enough for a snowstorm. You notice New York, 24 on Saturday is plenty cold enough for snow. Even D.C. at 29 degrees, and that'll be the big story. So for today, it's just a cold. At least it's sunny in most cases. Maybe a little bit of wintry precip around Oklahoma City. Tomorrow, not as many issues. We're kind of actually warming up slightly. And then as we head towards the weekend, Friday's the day we worry about, guys. Friday, the storm starts. And then it looks like Saturday will be a major storm. Coming up shortly, we'll talk more about the big storm and will it be a blizzard? It's going to be a big, it's going to be serious.
The battle of the European versus American models.
Yeah,
That's what
I know.
I learned
it's
yesterday.
so interesting. Yeah, seeing how different they are. All right, we'll talk about that blizzard next. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.